It is often said that history is not always very kind to leaders who have been in positions of power, especially when you're evaluating some of their controversial decisions in retrospect, that too when you have the advantage of hindsight. Now, this might even seem to be very harsh and very unfair, but that is the burden of power. It's very important to keep this in mind, especially when we are evaluating some of the controversial foreign policy decisions of few Indian prime ministers. It's very important to bring in a sense of balance and objectivity when we are evaluating some of these controversial topics. And that is exactly what we aim to do with this new series that we are launching today, right here on our YouTube channel. Starting today, through this week, we will be discussing some of India's biggest foreign policy controversies. So join me live every day from Monday to Friday, from 1st of April to 5th April, live here on our YouTube channel, to attend these sessions where we discuss some of the most controversial topics in Indian foreign policy. And I promise that these discussions would be politically unbiased. We will leave all the judgments out and ensure that the discussion is relevant for our UPSC Civil Services examination. So good evening and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. So today, we take up one of the most controversial topics in Indian foreign policy, that is the Kashmir issue and how it was handled by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. We are going to examine why Nehru took the Kashmir issue to the United Nations. In fact, this topic, even today, remains very relevant, as it remains one of the most debatable and polarized topics, even in current context. In fact, just a couple of months ago, Prime Minister Modi also brought up this issue on the floor of the House in the Parliament while he was addressing the budget session. Prime Minister Modi alleged that it was because of Prime Minister Nehru's mistakes that India paid a heavy price and the people of Jammu and Kashmir paid a heavy price. Essentially, PM Modi was indicating that due to some of the faulty decisions of Prime Minister Nehru with regard to the Kashmir issue, the way the issue was handled with Pakistan, and the way in which India took up the matter at the United Nations, which led to a weakening of India's position, that people of J&K and the rest of the country have paid a heavy price, as claimed by Prime Minister Modi. This was reiterated a few years ago by other top ministers of the government as well, including by Union Home Minister Amit Shah. Amit Shah had stated a few years back that Nehru made a big mistake in the Kashmir issue by taking it to the UN. He compared this to a Himalayan blunder. Then Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman also had made a similar statement. She had said that Nehru committed a huge mistake by internationalizing the Kashmir issue. So this represents one extreme side of the argument. It represents the critical view that points fingers towards Nehru with regard to these mistakes that were committed as far as the Kashmir issue was concerned. Now, if you look at the other side of the argument, there are several historians, experts and analysts who don't agree with this assessment. They argue that Nehru did not mishandle Kashmir. They point out with verifiable facts that Nehru took the best possible decision given the context, given the challenges that independent India was facing in 1947-48. And they even praised Nehru for ensuring that Kashmir was liberated from the occupation of Pakistani invaders. They even go to the extent of calling this allegation a myth, and they say that Nehru was a pragmatic leader who was, of course, influenced by a few idealistic values and principles, but at the same time, they say that Nehru was someone who could take realistic, pragmatic decisions. And the very decision to take the Kashmir issue to UN was based on such pragmatic thinking. So this represents the other extreme side of the argument. In fact, here you can see a very historic image that I've shared. You can see Prime Minister Nehru delivering a landmark speech at Srinagar's Lal Chowk in November 1947. This was after Srinagar was protected by Indian Army troops from the Pakistani invaders. The Indian troops had thrown out the Pakistani invaders and protected these areas of Kashmir. And you can even see Sheikh Abdullah, the then Prime Minister of J&K, seated next to Prime Minister Nehru. So this essentially is a highly polarized debate. So that is where we would like to bring in a sense of balance and objectivity to this discussion. So let's leave all political biases aside and let's rely only on verifiable historical facts and discuss whether Nehru was responsible for the Kashmir blunder. Was Nehru's decision to take the matter to the UN a correct one or a huge blunder which even today leads India to pay a price? So let's carry out this assessment, and to do that, first we have to begin with the history and the background. So first I'll take you through the timeline of key events with regard to India's independence and as well as the accession of Kashmir into India, and also a small discussion on the India-Pakistan War of 1947-48. Once we trace the timeline of these events, understand the chronology of events, then it becomes easier to take up each and every allegation against Nehru, especially the allegation about taking the matter to the UN, right? And then evaluate that objectively and see whether it was the right decision or not. So post the Second World War, India's freedom struggle had gained momentum. Britain had been a power in the decline. It was very evident that Britain would no longer be able to control its colonies, particularly the colony in India. So independence was only a matter of time, and various options were being considered as to how India could be granted independence. Partition had become a accepted reality by then due to large-scale communal polarization across the Indian subcontinent. And the British eventually came out with the Mountbatten Plan. The Mountbatten Plan, proposed by Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, seemed to be the most acceptable solution to the leaders of Indian National Congress and as well as the leaders of Muslim League, who were pushing for a communal state, a communal partition of the Indian subcontinent to create a separate country for the Muslim community called Pakistan. So under the Mountbatten Plan, a solution was proposed to grant independence to India and Pakistan, and also on how to deal with the hundreds of princely states that were present in British India. So as this was the most acceptable, viable partition solution, right, eventually it was enacted into a law, that is the Indian Independence Act of July 1947. It received the royal assent, and the Indian Independence Act paved the way for the establishment of two new dominions, the Indian Dominion and the Pakistani Dominion. So these dominions were being prepared for self-rule. They would eventually become independent sovereign nations. And the princely states, on the other hand, they were given an option. They were given three choices essentially under the Indian Independence Act. The princely states that were spread across India and Pakistan, today's India and Pakistan, they had the choice of either joining the Indian Dominion, or they could join the Pakistani Dominion, or they could even opt for remaining independent. So these were the three choices that were offered to the princely states that were present. So the legitimate authorities of the princely state, that is the monarch of each concerned princely state, they would decide whether to join India or Pakistan or to remain independent. So several princely states, they pledged their allegiance to the Indian Union, which was taking shape. But there were some princely states which were hesitant to join India. Now, for example, if you look at Jammu and Kashmir, which at that point was ruled by the Dogra dynasty under Raja Hari Singh, Raja Hari Singh expressed his initial hesitation to join the Indian Dominion. So following the independence of India and Pakistan, which was achieved on 14th and 15th August 1947, respectively, there was a concern in J&K whether J&K would merge with the Indian Dominion or the Pakistani Dominion. So Raja Hari Singh, who sat on this decision, would eventually take a call that the interests of J&K and the people of J&K would be better served if J&K remained independent. This had a lot to do with the personal ambition of Raja Hari Singh and also his misguided vision that he had for Jammu and Kashmir. Now, if you look at the demography of J&K, J&K had a very unique demography. The Kashmir region in particular was a Muslim majority region, but there were other minorities as well, including Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists as well. So Raja Hari Singh, who saw the unique demographic profile, the religious profile of J&K, was indeed concerned about the welfare of the religious communities. He saw that Pakistan had already turned into a theological state, which had adopted a rigid version of a religion as its official state religion. So, in a way, Raja Hari Singh was sure that there was no future with Pakistan, that if J&K were to merge, he wasn't sure about what would happen to the religious minorities, particularly the Hindus, the Sikhs, and the Buddhists. At the same time, he was hesitant to join India as well. Even though India was establishing itself as a secular nation, Raja Hari Singh had his reservations with regard to joining India. Because eventually, India would be a Hindu majority state. And Raja Hari Singh also had a self-ambition, a selfish agenda of sorts, which in a way prevented him from acceding to India immediately. Raja Hari Singh, he envisioned J&K as a possible Switzerland of the East, a neutral territory that could remain between the three major Asian powers, India, Pakistan, and China, and serve as a gateway to Central Asia. He was hesitant to give up his authority, his control over the monarchy as well, because if he were to merge with a democratic India, right, he would lose his authority and his status. So given that both the options were not feasible for Raja Hari Singh, as the legitimate authority of J&K, he had initially opted for independence. He was indecisive for several weeks, but his inclination was clearly towards remaining independent, and that technically made J&K an independent territory for a short period of time. For roughly around 2 months, around 70 odd days, J&K would remain an independent princely state, neither a part of India nor a part of Pakistan. Now, this is where Pakistan sensed an opportunity. Pakistan realized that the Kashmir region not only had a Muslim majority population, but also Kashmir was a gateway to Central Asia. Kashmir was where the major rivers that flowed into Pakistan originated from. The Indus Basin rivers, right, some of which originated in Tibet and in the Himalayan belt. The head stream of these rivers would mainly flow through Kashmir, and then the rivers would cross into Pakistan. So Pakistan saw the strategic and the cultural and economic significance of Kashmir, and it was motivated by this agenda to occupy and annex Kashmir, to forcefully merge Kashmir into the Pakistani dominion. So this is where it launched an operation called Operation Gulmarg. The Indian army has always believed, right, including the Indian government, that this invasion that happened in October 1947, on October 22nd, 1947, was planned and sponsored by the Pakistani state, by the Pakistani army. However, Pakistani army denies these allegations. Till date, it maintains that it was just a set of tribal Pashtuns who planned and carried out the invasion of Kashmir. But India strongly believed, and we still believe, that Operation Gulmarg was a planned Pakistani military operation to annex and occupy Kashmir illegally. So, according to India's allegations, Pakistan, it sponsored the Pashtun tribal militias from the Gilgit region and also towards the northwest parts of Pakistan to launch an attack on Kashmir in order to annex and occupy the territory. So as the tribal invasion began, Raja Hari Singh and his rudimentary forces, they were no match for the Pakistani invasion. And very quickly, the Pakistani intruders, who had the backing of Pakistani regular troops, they quickly started occupying territory, and they were at the doorsteps of Srinagar. It was under this difficult circumstance that Raja Hari Singh reached out to India asking for Indian assistance. So at that time, India's leadership, headed by Prime Minister Nehru, Home Minister Sardar Patel, and the Union Cabinet, they expressed the willingness to help Kashmir and assist Kashmir, but based on a condition. The condition was Kashmir has to accede to the Indian Union. Because until then, Raja Hari Singh, as the legitimate authority, had opted for independence, had remained independent without pledging allegiance either to India or Pakistan. So if India were to deploy troops without Kashmir acceding to India, then it would be a gross violation of international law, and possibly it could be India which could have been seen as the aggressor. Because in reality, it was Pakistan which was resorting to the aggressive step, backing the tribal militias to launch this invasion on Kashmir. So ensuring the accession of Kashmir was critical from a legal and geopolitical viewpoint. So based on this condition placed by Prime Minister Nehru, eventually Raja Hari Singh had to merge J&K into the Indian Union by signing the Instrument of Accession. On October 26, 1947, the Instrument of Accession was signed, and the Indian representative VP Menon would quickly rush the document, the legal document, to New Delhi to officially announce that Kashmir had acceded to the Indian Union. So with this, J&K merged with India, and as per the Indian Independence Act, technically the whole of J&K as it existed prior to independence would belong to India. But please note, by then, by the time the accession had happened, Pakistani intruders had already occupied large parts of territories, be it the Muzaffarabad region or the Gilgit-Baltistan region. All these areas, which were part of the erstwhile kingdom of J&K, they were already under the illegal occupation of Pakistani invaders who were backed by the Pakistani state and army. So, when Instrument of Accession was signed and J&K merged into the Indian Union, right? Of course, it was signed by the legitimate ruler, Raja Hari Singh. According to Indian Independence Act, Raja Hari Singh did have the authority to merge his entire princely state with India, and that is exactly what he had done. So now if Pakistan had carried out an illegal act of annexing and occupying part of the territory, that would be blatantly illegal under international law. It would be against the provisions of the Indian Independence Act as well. So India, since then, till date, we strongly believe that whatever territories in J&K that Pakistan has occupied, this is under the illegal occupation of Pakistan. India has a legitimate rightful claim on the entire territories of J&K as it existed prior to independence, right? And since Raja Hari Singh, the legitimate ruler, had merged J&K with India, even today, that is the claim that we insist upon, which is the correct claim of India. So now, after Instrument of Accession was signed and J&K merged into India, immediately India went to war against Pakistan. The Nehru government deployed Indian troops, and just in the nick of time, it managed to save Srinagar. But the Pakistani intruders had already captured large parts of territory that you see over here, which we today call as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. In fact, Pakistani invaders, the tribal militia with the support of Pakistani army troops, had come very close to Baramulla, Srinagar, etc. And they were at the doorstep of these critical locations. So that is when India intervened, and it triggered the first war between India and Pakistan. This conflict would last several months, from October 1947 all the way till December 1948. So during this war, the Indian troops fought back against the Pakistani invasion, and we even managed to reclaim some of the occupied territories. Several occupied areas were liberated by the Indian troops in the Jammu and Kashmir sector. And later, with the backing of Prime Minister Nehru, several areas even in the Kargil Dras Batalic sector, which was crucial for connecting Kashmir Valley with Ladakh, they were all retaken by Indian troops by pushing out the Pakistani intruders. So this is how India managed to reclaim some of the lost territory. But by then, Prime Minister Nehru decided that we should look for a mediated settlement. We should call for a ceasefire, and he decided to take the matter to the United Nations. So this is where the controversy comes up. That did Nehru do the right thing by taking the matter to the UN? What was the need to internationalize the issue? Since Pakistan was the aggressor here, since Pakistan was the one which had created the trouble, shouldn't India have continued the war, retaken all the occupied areas, including today's POK, and ensured that whole J&K would fully merge with India? Right? That is a criticism which comes up. The critics point out that the very decision to take the matter to the UN was a huge blunder on the part of the Prime Minister, especially when this turns into a political contest, political propaganda, right? The opposition parties which oppose the Congress, they often allege that all the issues related to Kashmir, including today's state-sponsored terrorism and separatist movement in Kashmir, is an outcome of this disastrous decision of Nehru to take this matter to the UN, right? So the UN, which intervened following India's appeal, it worked out a mediated settlement. A ceasefire was brought out, and the ceasefire was implemented from 1st of Jan 1949. The ceasefire line was also cemented through the Karachi Agreement signed in July 1949, which officially brought the first India-Pakistan war to an end. So by then, Indian troops, which had fought for a good 15 plus months, had pushed back the Pakistani troops, retaken some of the occupied areas, and it was at that point that Nehru took the matter to the UN and ensured that a ceasefire was called and the war came to an end. The war officially ended with the Karachi Agreement, and the ceasefire line would become the temporary de facto border between India and Pakistan in the Kashmir area, in the Kashmir region. But the UN did not stop at this. The UN, apart from mandating a ceasefire, it also gave itself a role to monitor the ceasefire. It established a UN military observer group in India and Pakistan, which would be stationed on both sides of Kashmir, that is in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir across the ceasefire line, and also on the Indian side of Jammu and Kashmir. So this UN military observer group in India and Pakistan would monitor the ceasefire, ensure that the region is demilitarized eventually, ensure that both India and Pakistan respect the ceasefire agreement, and patrol the ceasefire line as well, and report back to the UN Security Council if there are any violations done either by India or Pakistan. Along with that, the UN commission that dealt with the issue, the UN Commission on India and Pakistan, which had been established by UN Security Council, also mandated that a plebiscite should be held to let the people of J&K decide the sovereignty of Jammu and Kashmir. So the UN mandated a plebiscite, essentially a referendum, a direct election, where the people of J&K would vote and decide whether they want to join India or Pakistan, or whether they choose to remain independent. So now, this is where Prime Minister Nehru faces a lot of criticism by his political critics and opponents. Several experts and analysts and historians also lay the blame squarely at the doorstep of Nehru, and they accuse him of committing this blunder by involving the United Nations. They say that Nehru unnecessarily internationalized the Kashmir issue when we could have possibly pushed Pakistan out and taken all those areas that legitimately belong to India. Now the question is, how correct or how fair is this assessment? It's also argued that the UN during this mediation process was extremely biased against India. It was seen to be acting in favor of Pakistan quite openly, and it led to third-party involvement in what was a bilateral issue. What should have been just a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan was now blown out of proportion, and essentially it was internationalized, leading to third-party involvement. So the third parties referred to here includes the United Nations itself, and as well as the 5 permanent members of UN Security Council. That is primarily Britain, France, the United States, and of course, then Soviet Union and China. So particularly, India's concern was about the behavior of UK and later United States, and the bias that they were allegedly showing towards Pakistan, which went against Indian interests. So this would further complicate things for India, and for whatever has happened later, right? Nehru is blamed for this disastrous decision of taking the matter to the UN. They also allege that Nehru failed to retake Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. The critics argue that India had a golden opportunity. If Nehru had not taken the decision for a ceasefire, right, if he had not taken the matter to the UN, possibly India could have continued the war and retaken these occupied areas, which we today call as POK. They also criticize the later decisions related to J&K and its special status that was provided through a temporary provision in the Indian Constitution under Article 370. So there are a number of controversial topics tied and connected to this particular issue. So let's quickly examine and understand and thoroughly analyze these allegations against Prime Minister Nehru and see whether Nehru did make a mistake or a blunder in taking the matter to the UN. Let's look at this from all the arguments, from all the sides, right? And as I said, let's keep any political bias aside and carry out a neutral assessment based on verifiable, established historical facts. One major allegation that's brought up against Nehru here is that Nehru delayed the accession of Jammu and Kashmir. This was recently brought up by Union Minister Kiran Rijiju as well. He made few public statements, wrote a newspaper article as well, alleging that it was Jawaharlal Nehru who actually delayed the accession of J&K into India. He tries to point out that there is evidence to show that Maharaja Hari Singh was very much interested to join India right from the beginning. But according to Kiran Rijiju, please mind you, this is an allegation, right? It's alleged that Nehru delayed the accession to serve his own personal and political agenda. Because don't forget, Nehru was a Kashmiri Pandit himself. Now, let us test how true these claims are, these allegations are. Let's put this to a test. Let's rely on established historical facts to see whether the allegation is correct or not. Now, if you look at the developments of that critical period from June 1947 till November 1947, if you look at the established records, if you look at verifiable records of various former diplomats, experts and journalists, it's quite well documented that Nehru had no role to play in delaying the accession of Jammu and Kashmir. This is largely attributed to the indecisiveness of Raja Hari Singh himself. Raja Hari Singh, as I told you, was very eager to retain his power, to ensure that his authority remains. Plus, he did have a concern about joining either India or Pakistan, given the mixed demography of Jammu and Kashmir. He was worried about joining Pakistan because he wasn't sure how the religious minorities would be treated, as large-scale communal violence had already begun during partition between different communities. In Pakistan in particular, religious minorities were being targeted. Not just Hindus, Christians, Sikhs and Buddhists, even Muslims, even Shias, Hazaras, Ahmadiyas and other Sunnis who wouldn't abide by the rigid version of religion that Pakistan had adopted as state religion, right? Even they were persecuted and targeted as well. So Raja Hari Singh was correct in his assessment that J&K and the people of J&K had no future in joining Pakistan, right? At the same time, he had his concerns about joining India as well. He was worried that India at the end of the day would be a Hindu majority nation, and he was worried about losing his own authority as well. So this hesitation is well documented. For example, if you look at the writings and statements of his own son, Karan Singh, who would later become a Congress leader, he himself has pointed out and regretted the hesitation of his father, Raja Hari Singh, in acceding to India. So possibly, just think of the alternative. If Raja Hari Singh had not hesitated and waited for those crucial 2-3 months, and like other princely states, had he acceded to India immediately after independence or even prior to independence, possibly this could have preempted Pakistani attempts. Indian sovereignty would have been more firmly established and India would have deterred any such Pakistani attempt to try and annex Kashmir. But of course, this is just a matter of conjecture. But established facts and records show that there was hesitation on the part of Raja Hari Singh himself, and you can't really hold Nehru accountable for this. A.J. Nurani, a popular writer, popular lawyer and activist, he writes in his popular book, The Kashmir Dispute. He talks about a letter between Raja Hari Singh and Lord Mountbatten after the accession. If you go through this letter, right, you will clearly realize and understand that Raja Hari Singh indeed joined India only after the difficulty started, only after the Pakistani invasion. If not for that, Raja Hari Singh would have preferred to remain independent. So this is very evident from the writings of Raja Hari Singh himself. And in fact, right before Pakistani invasion began, Mountbatten had even visited Srinagar to meet Raja Hari Singh and convince him to either join India or Pakistan and not remain indecisive. But interestingly, Raja Hari Singh refused to meet Lord Mountbatten. He did not provide an appointment, he did not agree to meet with him and delayed and cancelled the meeting eventually, which again highlights his indecisiveness. So some of the top officials who were part of these parleys and discussions, they have documented the hesitation of Raja Hari Singh in acceding J&K into India. So this allegation falls apart if you look at established historical records, and you can't really hold Nehru accountable for this. The next big allegation that comes up, a related allegation, is that Nehru wasn't serious about India's sovereignty over Jammu and Kashmir. Now this again is countered by many historians and experts. They point to a very popular work of Victoria Schofield, a British historian, who had done some incredible work at that point in documenting all the developments that were taking place between India and Pakistan, particularly the Kashmir issue. So here, Victoria Schofield writes that the political advisor of Mountbatten, Sir Conrad Corfield, had actually suggested a trade-off between India and Pakistan to resolve some of the territorial issues that had come up. According to the suggestion, a trade-off was proposed where India would give up Kashmir, India would not claim Kashmir, and instead the two other problematic territories, that was Hyderabad and Junagadh, the two other princely states where problems had come up, they would accede with India if India agrees to trade that with Kashmir. Apparently this was one of the proposals that had been made by a British official. So the records here show that then Home Minister Sardar Patel and few other leaders were even actively considering a possible trade-off and trying to evaluate whether this was a viable choice for India. Because please understand, if you look at Hyderabad, it was largely a Hindu majority princely state ruled by the Nizam. If you look at Junagadh, which is in today's Gujarat, again it was a Hindu majority princely state ruled by the Nawab of Junagadh. So given the demographic profile and given that it was more critical to integrate Hyderabad and Junagadh because we could not afford any Pakistani enclaves inside India, it was considered at least for a short while whether a trade-off is viable for India, including by leaders like Sardar Patel and others. But at that time, it was Nehru who insisted that there can't be a compromise on Kashmir. This is well documented in other official records as well, that Nehru was quite determined to keep Kashmir with India, and there was no question of trading off any disputed territories. So while this allegation can be countered, the other allegation which comes up here is that Nehru relied excessively on the Muslim majority of Kashmir and also on a popular leader called Sheikh Abdullah. Right? This is often pointed out as a criticism against Nehru. It's said that Nehru insisted that Raja Hari Singh, who will be stepping down, should ensure that Sheikh Abdullah, the popular leader of National Conference, who had popular support from the majority Muslim population, should be appointed the Prime Minister of J&K. In fact, at that point, Sheikh Abdullah was in jail. He had been jailed by Raja Hari Singh. So Nehru went to a great deal of effort to ensure that Sheikh Abdullah was released from custody and Raja Hari Singh would appoint Sheikh Abdullah as the Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir. So this often is pointed out as a criticism against Nehru, and it is shown as one of the mishandling of the situation. Now let me tell you why it wasn't. Again, this is purely based on very established, verifiable records that is available of that era. Now see, here the basic logic was that if you want legitimacy to be provided to any integration of J&K into India, you would need popular support. You would need the support of the masses. Or else how else will you justify this in front of the international community? Because parallelly, in Hyderabad and Junagadh, where trouble was transpiring in 1948, right, 47-48, the Nizam of Hyderabad had clearly insisted on joining Pakistan, right? In Junagadh again, as I told you, a Hindu majority princely state, the Nawab had insisted on joining Pakistan. Of course, these positions in Hyderabad, Junagadh was unviable to India. In Junagadh, India blockaded the princely state, preventing any essential supplies. And eventually, Junagadh was annexed by Indian forces, and we even held a plebiscite to ensure that the people of Junagadh got a choice to express their views, their choice, and choose to join India. That is what gives international legitimacy for any such accession, right? And without this, if India was just seen as a forceful country occupying these areas, then India would be branded as the aggressor state. So if the Indian government, headed by all the top leaders, including Nehru back then, was insisting on a plebiscite and expressing the wishes of the people and focusing on gaining popular support in Junagadh and Hyderabad, why shouldn't the same approach be taken in J&K as well, right? In Hyderabad, the Nizam, who was against any accession with India, would even commit atrocities with the help of the Razakar militias. Later, Indian troops would intervene through Operation Polo and liberated Hyderabad following a brief conflict. But clearly, the popular support was on the Indian side in Hyderabad, which helped in the easy merger and accession of Hyderabad into India. Similarly, in J&K, right, J&K was indeed a Muslim majority princely state, ruled by the Dogra king, with Hindu minorities and other religious minorities. So if this merger had to have legitimacy in front of the international community, getting popular mass support was critical, was essential. Just like we were seeking the Hindu majority support in Hyderabad and Junagadh, similarly, the Muslim majority support in J&K was crucial as well. And Sheikh Abdullah was the popular leader. As the leader of National Conference, he had gained the popular support, and he was also seen as a secular socialist leader, someone who would align with the ideology of the Indian government, the Indian National Congress as well. So given these challenges and these circumstances, Nehru did rely on ensuring that public support, mass support was secured, and Sheikh Abdullah was put in place as the popular leader to give legitimacy to this merger and accession. And that is the reason why this approach was adopted. So rather than being a criticism, this is actually a prudent policy that India pursued to ensure that we do have international support and we don't face any kind of criticism against India, and ensure that India shouldn't be branded as the aggressor. But apart from this, the biggest allegation which we are discussing, the core issue that we are discussing under this session, which is the allegation that did Nehru commit a blunder by taking the matter to the UN? Because all these are related criticisms and allegations, right? You need to get the complete picture. While we can dismiss the other two allegations based on verifiable facts and records, when it comes to this question, the answer is very clear that Nehru did indeed commit a big mistake. Nehru himself would express regret later through his speeches and writings that we did make a mistake by taking the matter to the United Nations. So let's understand why India took the matter to the UN in the first place. What pushed India to do that? What led Nehru to do that? What were the circumstances? What were the motivations behind it? And how come Nehru came to regret this later? And what was the impact of this? So that should be the last part of the discussion. See, at this point, please understand the difficult challenges that India was facing as well, right? If you have to look at this holistically, right, you need to look at the complex challenges that India was dealing with. Kashmir was not the only problem at that point, right? There were many other princely states which were hesitant to join India. Take the Kingdom of Travancore, for example, right? And a few other princely states in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. Some of them were hesitant to join India, to merge with India. So they needed convincing. They needed incentives, and some of them had to be threatened, and sometimes force also had to be used, like in Hyderabad and Junagadh, to push for the merger of these princely states into India. In Northeast India, insurgencies had broken out. The Naga insurgency had already started from 1947. India was dealing with massive economic problems, large-scale poverty. India's agriculture, India's industries had been destroyed by colonial exploitation, right? There wasn't enough food to feed our people. Lack of electricity, lack of basic necessities. And this was the last thing that India wanted. The last thing we wanted was a full-fledged war and a conflict with Pakistan. But at the same time, taking the matter to the UN in itself was not a decision entirely taken by the Prime Minister. Here, records clearly establish that Nehru was influenced quite heavily by Lord Mountbatten, The British had a vested interest to push this matter to the UN, right? So that they could intervene, they could gain a leverage here and meddle with this issue. So this is where Nehru would commit a historical mistake, a policy mistake would be made, right? And he would realize this mistake later, and he has expressed regret as well through several speeches and writings. So let's examine this further. See, India's attempt here, when we took the matter to the UN, was to ensure that we brand Pakistan as the aggressor. India's interest was to not bring the Kashmir issue as a matter of sovereignty. India believed that the matter of sovereignty had been settled the moment instrument of accession had been signed by Raja Hari Singh. India's strong belief was that legally, technically, J&K had become a part of India. There was no question about its sovereignty anymore. But when we took the matter to the UN expanded the mandate. The UN Security Council, it expanded the mandate and turned India's question that had been brought up, which was to bring pressure on Pakistan as the aggressor, push Pakistan to withdraw the troops and ensure that peace and stability is restored. Instead of that, the UN expanded the mandate and turned this into the very question of Kashmir's sovereignty. It widened the terms of reference, and this is where India had a massive setback. See, this matter was referred to UN under Article 35 of the UN Charter. Article 35 essentially deals with territorial disputes, bilateral disputes between UN member states. So this is where Nehru faces criticism that India should have never referred the matter under Article 35. Because the question here was not about Kashmir's sovereignty. It was about blaming Pakistan correctly for being the aggressor, bringing international diplomatic pressure on Pakistan to push the troops out and to ensure Pakistan returns back to status quo, to ensure that India gains full control of over Jammu and Kashmir as per the instrument of accession that had been signed by Raja Hari Singh. But instead, matter was referred to UN under Article 35, and this is where probably India made a technical diplomatic mistake. And again, what influenced Nehru here? It was Lord Mountbatten, and this is where Nehru probably should have stood his ground. Thinking that Mountbatten was acting in the best interest of India, the matter was referred to the UN, and as it is documented through various writings and records, amongst the P5 countries, the 5 permanent members, a clear bias was shown towards Pakistan, particularly by Britain. Britain always saw Pakistan as a more reliable ally than India. The Cold War rivalries had just begun as well between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, and later US as well started relying on Pakistan as a reliable geopolitical partner. As India was remaining neutral and it was looking to champion the non-aligned movement, Britain and US collectively saw Pakistan as a more reliable ally. US and Pakistan would even sign military agreements. US would even start supplying weapons to Pakistan to modernize Pakistan's armed forces. Britain and Pakistan would enter into a military alliance as well, along with few other countries. So, beginning with Britain and then with US, a clear bias was shown by the permanent members in favor of Pakistan. So, Ramchandra Guha, popular historian, notes that this was the big setback that India suffered at the UN after we referred the matter under Article 35. After the Nehru government had referred the matter under Article 35, the Security Council widened the agenda. It widened the scope of the discussion from just being the question of Kashmir to the sovereignty of Kashmir, which India was claiming to have on J&K. It was turned into a sovereignty issue when that was not the question that India was trying to raise. The UN decided to adjudicate on whether India or Pakistan have sovereignty on Kashmir. India's sovereignty had been established already as soon as Raja Hari Singh signed the instrument of accession as per the Indian Independence Act. Sovereignty was never under question. The whole of J&K should have belonged to India. But by taking the matter to the UN, right, with the betrayal by these permanent members, Britain and later US, the mandate itself was changed under Article 35, turning this into a dispute between India and Pakistan. Pakistan should have never been a stakeholder. Pakistan was the aggressor here. Pakistan was the one which had violated international law, and accordingly UN should have ordered the Pakistani troops to be withdrawn. But instead, it was turned into a dispute, territorial dispute, a sovereignty dispute, and Pakistan was treated as an equal stakeholder in this dispute. So this was the big setback that India suffered, and Nehru himself would go on to regret his decision with regard to taking the matter to the UN. Right? Now, again, the big question is, what explains this? Why would Nehru do that? Nehru had a misplaced faith in the UN. He was seen as a progressive, liberal leader, right? And he was seen as a renowned statesman as well. He was someone who stood for democratic values. He stood for Gandhian principles as well. And he strongly believed that India should lead the world in maintaining peace and stability following the two world wars. So it was an idealistic goal that Nehru had set. And over here, Nehru truly believed that UN could play a positive mediating role. He genuinely believed that the UN, which had just been set up after the Second World War, right, its very mandate was to maintain peace and stability, to resolve such conflicts and disputes. So he placed unnecessary faith, or rather too optimistic faith on the UN, hoping for a fair resolution through the UN. Nehru himself would later admit through one of his speeches that primarily to avoid the continuation of the war, we took the matter to UN, and now I realize that I've made a mistake. Now I realize that it's a blunder that has been committed. Right? So it shows that Nehru himself was disillusioned with the UN later. Once the betrayal was seen by the permanent members led by Britain and later US, Nehru saw that his faith, his belief in the UN was shaken. But after that, Nehru would swore, he took this commitment to protect Indian interests in Kashmir at any cost. So to answer the question whether it was a willing mistake or a negligent mistake, right, this is more of a mistake that happened, right, which is easy to call as a blunder in retrospect. But in those difficult circumstances, in those challenging times, right, the misplaced faith in the UN is what led to the blunder. But yes, many experts, many historians, and many supporters of Nehru themselves, and Nehru himself, they've all agreed that this indeed was a mistake to, internationalize the issue and take the matter to the UN. Ideally, it should have been settled between India and Pakistan, and ideally we should not have expected UN to act in a fair and neutral manner. Right? It was just the optimistic view of Nehru which led him to put that faith on the UN, and influenced by Lord Mountbatten, referred the matter under Article 35. Now the impact was quite evident. Plebiscite had been promised as per the UN mediated ceasefire. Right? India was more than willing to hold a plebiscite initially. In fact, not just Nehru, even Sardar Patel and the Union cabinet at that point believed that without the wishes of the people, we can't forcefully annex and merge territories into India, or else there will be no legitimacy. To ensure that we have international approval, to ensure that the people are willingly joining India, even Indian leaders were completely supportive of a plebiscite. But this promised plebiscite never took place because the precondition was never met. The precondition to hold a plebiscite was that peace has to be maintained. Pakistan has to return back to status quo position, which it never did. Pakistan did not retreat, it continued maintaining the troops, declared the occupied territories as Azad Kashmir, and tried to wean away Gilgit-Baltistan, and even tried changing the demography of the region. By looking at these developments, India also went back on its commitment, and this promised plebiscite has never been held by both India and Pakistan. Other than that, through UN mediation, the ceasefire which was worked out led to the drawing of the ceasefire line that you see over here. Whatever positions that were held by Indian and Pakistani troops at the end of the war, right, in late 1948, that would become the temporary de facto boundary line, and it has been given legitimacy as the ceasefire line through the Karachi Agreement of 1949, which brought the first war to an end. You can see that it divides Jammu and Kashmir, which is under India's control. You can see Pakistan occupied Kashmir, where Pakistan is under the illegal occupation of these territories. You can also see point NJ 9842, which is the northernmost point of the ceasefire line. But however, the problem here for India, the impact was that the UN had given itself a role in the Kashmir dispute. A third-party role had been established, which meant UK and US and other P5 members could constantly interfere with regard to the Kashmir issue. So this remained a concern for India for many more years to come. from 1949, since the UN Military Observer Group was established, right? It would establish a presence both in POK and on the Indian side, and it would report to the UN Security Council. It would patrol the ceasefire line as well and monitor the activities of Indian and Pakistani troops. It would liaise with them, try to maintain peace and stability to ensure that the ceasefire which was committed was upheld. But this was seen as interference through the UN, interference by third parties, and that is something which caused a lot of concern for India. This continued until 1971. India utilized the opportunity created by the liberation of Bangladesh in 1971, where India had played a direct role in breaking Pakistan into two parts. India had backed and supported the liberation war in Bangladesh. And as East Pakistan broke away and Bangladesh was liberated, India had a complete leverage on Pakistan at that point. The then Indira Gandhi government in 1972 worked out the Shimla Agreement, which ended the Third India-Pakistan War. So in the Shimla Agreement, India carefully converted the ceasefire line into the LOC, the line of control that you have today. So by this renaming, India-Pakistan agreed that this would be the de facto boundary. So as a result, there was no ceasefire line anymore. The ceasefire line that had been established under Karachi Agreement had now been redrawn and replaced and rebranded by the Shimla Agreement of 1972. Now, what is the big development from this? The big development here is that the role of UN was eliminated with Shimla Agreement. The third party involvement was cleverly eliminated by India. That is the big change that happened after Shimla Agreement. See, UN Military Observer Group had been established under Karachi Agreement to monitor the ceasefire line. So legally speaking, technically speaking, if there is no ceasefire line anymore, if it's been redrawn and renamed as line of control or LOC, what will the Military Observer Group monitor? What will the UN do if there is no ceasefire line itself? If both the bilateral parties, that is India, Pakistan, have agreed that this de facto temporary boundary is no longer called ceasefire line, now we are going to call it line of control. Also in 1971, there were some territorial gains that India had made. In some parts, India had taken some territories. You can see the slight realignment that has happened in the temporary boundary line when you compare the line of control of Shimla Agreement with the ceasefire line of Karachi Agreement. So this realignment and rebranding was of great significance because this ensured that the UN role was eliminated because the Military Observer Group, it had nothing to monitor. There was no ceasefire line anymore after Shimla Agreement. Is that clear? So that is how India ended the direct UN involvement in the Kashmir issue. Since then, we have insisted that Kashmir is a bilateral issue. The problems created by UN's involvement was erased through the Shimla Agreement under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and Pakistan also agreed to this because India held all the leverage. We held almost 95,000 Pakistani soldiers as POWs after 1971 war, right? Plus, East Pakistan had been liberated. We held few territories in West Pakistan as well. So using this as a leverage, India forced Pakistan to agree to this, that there is no ceasefire line anymore, and it is rebranded, redrawn as the line of control. So thereby UN's role was eliminated and both countries committed that there won't be any third party involvement going forward. Neither UN will be involved, nor Britain, nor US, nor China. No other third party will be involved. This is a guarantee that Pakistan gave to India. So that is why even today we bring up the Shimla Agreement. Let's say with regard to China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. China is investing in these projects that pass through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which is a direct challenge to India's sovereignty. So when India opposes the CPEC project, we point out to Pakistan's commitment that had been made in 1972 under Shimla Agreement, where Pakistan promised that there won't be any third-party involvement. So that's why India doesn't tolerate any kind of interference by a third party, be it by US or China or by the UN. So this has been ensured through Shimla Agreement. Now, coming to one of the last points. Now we understood that yes, indeed, taking the matter to UN was a mistake. Nehru himself admitted to this, right? But of course, it was not a willing or negligent mistake. It was a decision taken in those circumstances. Now it's easy to look back in hindsight, in retrospect, and say that this could have been done or that could have been done, right? Yes, indeed, it was a regrettable error on India's part, but quickly the corrections were made by 1972. UN's role had been eliminated. But another big allegation that comes up against Nehru is that Nehru failed to retake Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Critics point out Nehru should have continued the war, dragged the war and taken all the occupied areas, thus fully merging J&K into Indian Union. Now, many experts point out why this was not feasible, it was not possible. It was a logical decision to stop the war and push for a ceasefire. Let me explain why. Because as a Kashmiri Pandit, Nehru of course understood the topography, the terrain, the difficult climate and the geography of Kashmir. Not just the Prime Minister, the top army generals, many of them were British officers as well. Right? There was a bit of hesitance among the British officers to fight this war as well. Right? Because the British Indian Army, which had been split between India and Pakistan, many of the top general officers, they were headed by British officials. They were hesitant to fight against each other. Apart from their own hesitation, right, they were against the continuation of the war because given the difficult terrain and geography and the logistics needed, both sides did not have the kind of military preparedness to drag and continue the conflict. Remember, this was 1947-48 that we are talking about. Plus, there were many more challenges that India was preoccupied with. Kashmir was not the only problem. There was Hyderabad, Junagadh, other princely states, northeast India, massive economic problems from poverty to lack of industrial development. There were many, many other challenges for India, and a continued war would have dragged India down. So it was a prudent, pragmatic decision to end the war. But taking it to the UN, right, is one regrettable error that Nehru did commit. So that is what we take away from this assessment. Is that clear? Experts point out, several former Indian Army officers, Indian diplomats who were involved in these developments, they themselves have pointed out that Indian Army was suffering from severe shortages at that point of time, from lack of ammunition to lack of logistics, given the difficult terrain and the high altitude mountainous regions of Kashmir. Dragging and continuing the war would have been extremely challenging and almost impossible. So there was no question of retaking or recapturing POK at that point. Again, as I said, today it's easy to say that, sitting in the comfort of the room, it's easy to say that, yes, we could have continued the war, we should have recaptured POK. But given the circumstances, the context of that era, right, that's where you should look at the decision. So what can be held as a blunder is indeed the decision to take the matter to the UN, right, which Nehru himself and other experts also have correctly acknowledged that it indeed was an error. It brought UN into play and it internationalized the issue unnecessarily. Right? So, but other than that, all the other allegations largely fall apart because many of them could be politically motivated as well. Now, another issue which has always stuck to Nehru and the then government is Article 370. Why was the special status given? When Instrument of Accession was signed by Maharaja Hari Singh, only 3 subjects were devolved to India: external affairs, communication and defense. In all the other matters, J&K Assembly would retain its jurisdiction, right? And as promised to Raja Hari Singh, India delivered a special status as well in the future constitution that was adopted in 1950, where a temporary special provision was added, that is Article 370, to provide for a separate constitution to J&K. The J&K Constituent Assembly dissolved itself before revoking this temporary provision, and thus in a way it became a permanent feature as well. But recently the Modi government has undone this. The special status has been abrogated along with the special provisions of Article 35. That itself has become a separate political controversy altogether. So if you ask me why the special status was given, what was the need for it? Because critics point out this prevented the full integration of J&K into the Indian Union. But however, if you look at the other side of the argument, providing the special status was largely taking into account the difficult circumstances in which J&K had joined in India. Right? It was the pressure created by the Pakistani invasion and the difficult circumstances that pushed Raja Hari Singh to sign the Instrument of Accession, right? And this situation had not been faced with the other princely states at that point. Of course, it was meant to be a temporary provision, but due to the dissolution of the J&K Assembly, which only had the authority to remove it, right? It indeed became a permanent feature of sorts, which was now revoked with the changes that was done under the Modi government in 2019. So long story short, can you hold one person or one leader accountable for any mistakes or blunders? In certain cases, yes. But again, it has to be an unbiased argument. It has to be free from any political propaganda, political influences. So if you look at this issue from that prism, that perspective, some of the allegations simply fall apart. The allegation that J&K delayed, J&K's accession was delayed by Nehru, or that India could have taken back POK, or Article 370 was not at all needed. Right? These allegations largely fall apart, but what really sticks is the decision to take the matter to the UN, which indeed has been seen as a blunder by India, as a mistake by India. So now let's conclude the session. Please take up a few practice questions which might be asked on these lines. The ceasefire line in Jammu and Kashmir between India and Pakistan was rebranded as line of control through which agreement? 4 options are given. I want you guys to tell me what's the correct answer in the comment section below. Next, another question. What's the function of a UN military observer group? What is its exact role? So I provided 4 options. Please go through this. Take a screenshot if you want. Go back to the explanation where I explained what is the role of a UN military observer group, and then try to give the correct answer. Please mention the answers of these 2 questions in the comments below. You can also take down a couple of mains practice questions which you can use for your answer writing practice. So please try to write an answer and prepare for this topic, right, if there is any possible question either in prelims or mains. So I hope you guys have liked the discussion today. Do let me know what you think in the comments. Do press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So this series will continue for 4 more days. So join me again at 7 p.m. tomorrow. We have many more interesting topics lined up. So you can take a look at the schedule that I shared earlier. And by Friday, we will complete these 5 controversial foreign policy decisions of India. Now this series will continue in other subjects as well. Throughout the month of April, we will continue these important discussions. All our expert faculties from Sarmad sir to Sham sir to Mukesh and Abhishek sir, all of them will be taking up such interesting topics from their subjects throughout the month of April. So these sessions will happen from Monday to Saturday at 7 p.m. And we saw the comments that a lot of people are asking for the prelims crash course. So Conquer Prelims 2024, our prelims current affairs crash course will start from 1st of May. So please look forward to that. And do subscribe to the channel to attend all these initiatives. That is it for today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.